They put Clara Whitefeather in a cage meant for wolves, and by noon the whole town had learned how quiet cruelty could be. The iron bars stood in the center of Red Ash, right where wagons usually stopped and children usually chased dust devils through the street. Someone had dragged the cage out from behind the livery, knocked the old rust loose with a hammer, and set it under the hard Arizona sun with a board wired to the front that read, "In O water until she confesses." The letters were thick and black, painted by a hand that wanted to be seen. Clara sat inside with her back straight, her dress dusted pale from the road, her lips dry, her hands folded around something small she kept hidden in her lap. She did not cry out. She did not beg. That seemed to bother the town more than if she had screamed. Folks stood in loose circles around her, hats low, mouths tight, pretending they had only stopped to look for a minute. A woman held a handkerchief to her nose as if mercy had a smell she could not bear. A boy leaned against a water barrel 10 feet away, staring at the tin cup hanging from its side, then at Clara, then back at the ground when his father touched his shoulder. Sheriff Elias Boone stood near the jail steps with the key in his vest pocket and shame in his eyes, but shame never opened a lock by itself. The church bell gave one tired note in the heat. That was when Nathaniel Mercer rode into Red Ash on a sorrel mare with tired legs and a saddle that had seen too many lonely miles. Folks called him Nate, when they called him anything at all. He had come to sell that mare, his last good horse, because grief had a way of eating a man down to the bone and then charging him rent for the silence. It was the anniversary of his little girl's passing. Abigail had been 6 years old, small as a winter bird, with a laugh that used to fill the cabin brighter than lamplight. Nate had not planned on staying in town. He meant to take whatever money the mare brought, buy a bottle cheap enough to hate, and ride back to the empty place where his house leaned against the wind. Then he saw the cage. Then he saw Clara. And just as he turned his eyes away, telling himself this was not his sorrow and not his fight, a sound slipped through the bars. 3 thin notes, weak, trembling, played on a little harmonica that caught the sunlight like a piece of memory. Nate's hand tightened on the reins. His mare stopped before he asked her to. The street seemed to fall back from him, boardwalk, dust, bell, faces, all of it pulling away until there was only that sound. 3 notes. The same 3 Abigail used to play at bedtime when she was too proud to admit she was sleepy. Clara lowered the harmonica from her mouth and looked straight at him through the iron. Not pleading, not frightened, just watching, as if she had been waiting for the one man in Red Ash who would know that song. Nate Mercer did not move for a long moment. He just sat in the saddle with the reins pulled tight across his gloved hand, listening to the last breath of those 3 notes die in the heat. The harmonica was old, nickel-worn thin at the corners, one side bent where a child might have dropped it against a hearthstone or tucked it too hard into a coat pocket. Abigail had carried one just like it everywhere. To church, to the creek, to the little patch of shade behind their cabin where she used to sit with her knees in the dust and try to make songs out of air. Nate had buried that sound with her, or thought he had. The people of Red Ash watched him now, not with kindness, but with the careful interest folks give a man standing too close to a fire. They knew his name. They knew his grief. Some of them had stood behind curtains the night he rode through town with his daughter wrapped in a quilt, asking for medicine on credit, asking for mercy as if mercy were something a man could buy by the ounce. The apothecary had looked toward the bank before he answered. Jeremiah Pike had been there too, leaning against the counter in a clean gray coat, his pocket watch shining like a small moon. No credit, he had said. Not against land already mortgaged. Nate had not raised his voice that night. He had only looked at the bottle on the shelf, the one the doctor said might lower the fever, and then at the faces behind the glass. By sunrise, Abigail was gone. By spring, his wife had followed in spirit before her body gave up. After that, Red Ash became a place Nate passed only when necessity dragged him through. He stopped shaking hands, stopped entering the church, stopped answering when people said they were sorry, because sorry had not opened a door when his child was breathing shallow under a damp cloth. Now Jeremiah Pike stood near the cage with both thumbs hooked in his vest, watching Nate with a banker's calm and a wolf's patience. Pike owned more roofs in Red Ash than the rain did. He owned the notes on half the ranches, the back room of the general store, and enough favors to make honest men lower their eyes. Beside him, Sheriff Elias Boone touched the key in his pocket and let his hand fall away again. Nate saw it. Clara saw it too. Inside the cage, she held the harmonica as if it weighed more than iron. The sun shone across her pale face, across the dust at her collar, across the quiet dignity that refused to bend for a crowd. Nate told himself to ride on. He told himself the dead did not come back just because a tune did. He told himself that grief makes a man hear ghosts in common sounds. Then Clara lifted the harmonica slightly and spoke through lips cracked by thirst, her voice low enough that only he and the first row heard it. I found this on the North Road, where the medicine wagon never reached your house. Nate's mare shifted under him, but Nate went still as fence wire in a hard frost. Across the square, Jeremiah Pike's smile disappeared for less than a second. It was not much. It was barely a change. But Nate had spent years learning what silence could hide, and in that small, vanished smile, he heard the first true sound Red Ash had made in a long, long time. The words crossed the square like a match struck in a dry barn. No one spoke at first. Even the horses tied along the rail seemed to lower their heads, as if they understood that something old had just come loose from the earth. Nate looked at Clara through the bars, and for the first time he saw more than a prisoner under the sun. He saw road dust on the hem of her dress, the kind that came from walking miles without rest. He saw a thin line of white salt on her sleeves from dried sweat. He saw hands that had worked, not stolen. Hands that had carried water, tied bandages, held small things carefully enough not to break them. Clara did not look away from him. She had learned long before that fear fed men who wanted power, so she gave them none. That morning, before the cage, before the sign, before Red Ash gathered around her like a court without a judge, she had come down from the North Road with a canteen at her hip and a warning in her throat. The town well had turned bitter. She had smelled it before she reached the first house, that sharp mineral stink rising under the sweetness of wet rope and bucket wood. 2 children near the pump had been coughing. A woman had blamed the heat. A man had blamed bad luck. Clara had knelt by the trough, touched 2 fingers to the water, and known at once that luck had nothing to do with it. She went straight to Sheriff Boone. She told him the water was wrong. She told him the cattle would refuse it by evening and the children would suffer first. Boone had listened just long enough to become afraid. Then Jeremiah Pike entered the office, slow and polished, brushing trail dust from a sleeve that had never seen real work. He asked where she had been. He asked why she knew so much. He asked why a stranger would come alone to warn a town that had never welcomed her. By noon his questions had become rumors. By 1 o'clock the rumors had become certainty. By 2, Red Ash had found the shape of its fear and given it her name. They said Clara had poisoned the well. They said she had carried sickness in a pouch. They said she had smiled when the children coughed, though no one had seen her smile at all. The truth was smaller and harder to look at. Clara had seen 2 of Pike's men near the north storage shed before dawn, loading sacks into a wagon under a canvas cover. One sack had split on the road. Pale powder had spilled into the wheel ruts and shone like ash. She had followed the trail to the well, then to the livery, then to the trough where a little boy had leaned too far over the edge trying to pull up a dropped toy. Clara had grabbed his collar and pulled him back before he fell in. That was when they seized her. Not for doing harm, for standing too close to the proof. Now, inside the cage, beneath the eyes of the town, she shifted the harmonica into one hand and used the other to point toward the livery. Her voice came thin, but steady. Under the back trough, she said, "There is a leather pouch wrapped in feed cloth." Pike turned his head slowly toward the livery, and the movement was calm enough to fool most men. But not Nate. Not a man who had watched grief teach him the language of hidden guilt. For the first time since Abigail died, Nate felt something move inside him that was not sorrow. It was not hope yet. Hope was too clean a word. It was a spark under ashes, and it had teeth. Jeremiah Pike stepped forward before anyone could move toward the livery, and the square seemed to tighten around him. He did not shout. Men like Pike never needed to. His voice carried because half the town owed him money, and the other half hoped never to. He lifted one hand toward Clara, palm open, as if presenting a fact already settled by heaven. "You hear that?" he said. "She has been hiding things on our property, speaking of poison, pointing fingers, stirring panic while our children lie sick in their beds." A murmur moved through the crowd, low and uneasy. Fear did the rest of his work for him. It ran from face to face quicker than any horse could run down Main Street. A mother near the pump pressed both hands together and whispered a prayer that sounded more like blame than mercy. A shopkeeper took 2 steps back from Nate, as if kindness might stain his boots. Sheriff Boone looked toward the livery, then toward Pike, then toward the cage. The key still sat heavy in his pocket. Nate could see the shape of it under the cloth. So could Clara. Boone was not a cruel man. That was the worst of it. Cruel men made easy villains. Weak men made quiet disasters. Boone had spent years mistaking peace for justice, and Red Ash had learned to hide its sins inside his silence. Pike turned to him with a gentle smile that had no warmth in it. "Sheriff," he said, "I believe the town has waited long enough." Boone swallowed. The sun flashed against the badge on his chest, bright for 1 second, then dull again. Nate remembered another night under that same badge. Boone had been there outside the apothecary when Abigail burned with fever in Nate's arms. Not from cruelty, not from hate, just standing there, hat in hand, saying nothing while the door stayed closed. That was how Red Ash worked. Doors closed. Men watched. Women whispered. Children learned. Then years later, everyone called it fate. Clara shifted inside the cage, and the iron gave a tired creak beneath her weight. She had not drunk since morning. Still, she held herself upright, eyes steady beneath the brim of heat and dust. "I came to warn you," she said, each word dry but clear. "The well is wrong. The sickness is in the water." Pike laughed softly, and somehow that sound felt colder than anger. "The water was fine before you came," he said. "The crowd liked that. It gave them a straight road through a crooked truth. A stranger arrived, trouble followed, and now the stranger must answer for it. Simple, clean, false." Nate looked past Pike to the water barrel beside the mercantile. A tin cup hung there by a cord, swinging a little in the hot wind. 10 feet from the cage. Maybe less. He could smell wet wood from where he sat, could hear the water shift inside the barrel when a wagon rolled somewhere down the street. Clara could hear it too. Her eyes moved to the cup only once. She did not ask. That made Nate feel smaller than if she had. Pike followed Nate's gaze and smiled again. "Do not make this personal, Mercer." Nate looked at him then, really looked. The kind of look a man gives a locked door before deciding whether the hinges are worth saving. Pike went on, smooth as oiled leather. "This town has suffered enough grief. You of all men ought to understand what grief makes people do." The words landed in the dust between them. Abigail's name had not been spoken, but every person there heard it anyway. Nate felt the old wound open, not sharp, just deep, like a well with no bottom. He saw his little girl's hands around that harmonica, saw his wife sitting by the stove after the burial, staring at nothing while snow tapped the window, saw Red Ash going on with its Sunday bells and warm bread and clean windows, as if his home had not gone dark a mile outside town. Then Clara spoke again, softer now, but it carried. "I tried to bring medicine to a little girl once." Nate's breath stopped. Pike's head turned. Boone closed his eyes, and the whole square seemed to understand, all at once, that the cage in front of them might not be holding the guilty person after all. Nate Mercer swung down from the saddle so slowly that the leather barely creaked. The street seemed to listen to his boots when they touched the dust. He did not reach for the rifle tied beside his bedroll. He did not touch the revolver at his hip. He only lifted the canteen from his saddle horn, pulled the cork free with his teeth, and walked toward the cage as if every face in Red Ash had become no more than boards on an old fence. The crowd parted, not out of respect, but because grief has a weather of its own, and no one wanted to stand too close to his. Clara watched him come. Her fingers tightened around the harmonica, but her eyes stayed on the canteen. Water moved inside it with a small hollow sound. A sound simple enough to be holy. Jeremiah Pike stepped into Nate's path before he reached the bars. His clean boots planted themselves in the dirt between mercy and thirst. "That is far enough, Mercer," Pike said. His voice stayed smooth, but there was a new edge under it, thin and bright. "This is town business." Nate looked past him to Clara. Her breathing was shallow, but her back remained straight. That bothered him. It made the cage look smaller than it was, as though the iron had failed at the one thing it had been built to do: break what was inside. Nate raised the canteen. "Then town business can spare one drink." Pike's smile returned, but it did not sit right on his face. "You put that water through those bars, and you answer for her. Every lie she has told, every sickness she brought, every family that suffers because of her. Nate looked at the people around him. He saw the mercantile owner who had once refused him lamp oil on credit. Saw the apothecary who had lowered his window shade while Abigail coughed against Nate's coat. Saw Mrs. Calloway from the church, clutching her Bible with both hands, unable to meet Clara's eyes. Folks who could sing hymns on Sunday and watch a woman dry out on Monday. The kind of folks who believed decency was something to be worn clean, not used hard. Sheriff Boone took one step off the jail porch. Just one, then stopped. Nate heard it more than saw it. The sound of a man almost becoming brave. Almost was a poor word. It had buried too many people. Clara lifted the harmonica again, not to play this time, but to hold it where Nate could see the dent along the silver side. Abigail had made that dent trying to crack walnuts on the porch rail. Nate remembered scolding her. He remembered her smile afterward, wide and guilty, asking if music sounded better with scars. His hand shook once, barely. "Where did you get it?" he asked. Clara's lips parted, and the square leaned closer without meaning to. "On the North Road," she said, "near the bend past Cottonwood, Washington. There was a medicine wagon there. 2 men had stopped it. They moved the crates to another team and sent the driver south. I found this in the dust after they left." Nate felt the town tilt under him. Cottonwood Wash sat 6 miles from his cabin, 6 miles from the bed where Abigail had waited for medicine that never came. Pike said nothing. That silence walked louder than a confession. Nate stepped around him. Pike reached out as if to stop him, then thought better of doing it in front of so many eyes. Nate came to the cage, knelt in the dust, and held the canteen through the bars. Clara looked at the water, then at him. "Do not make yourself their enemy for me," she said. Nate's face did not change, but something old and frozen moved behind his eyes. "I am not doing it for you alone," he said. "I am standing where I should have stood years ago." Clara took the canteen with both hands. She drank one careful swallow, then another, as though even thirst could be met with dignity. The whole town watched that water pass from his hand to hers, and in that quiet exchange, Red Ash understood what Jeremiah Pike had understood first. Nate Mercer had not given a prisoner a drink. He had chosen a side. Pike's face stayed still, but his hands gave him away. One thumb rubbed the edge of his pocket watch, slow and hard, like a man trying to polish gilt until it looked respectable. Nate rose from the dust and kept the empty canteen in his hand. Clara passed it back through the bars, and for a moment their fingers nearly touched, separated by iron and all the old laws people invented when they wanted mercy to have a fence around it. Sheriff Boone cleared his throat, but no words came. The town waited for Nate to lower his eyes, to apologize, to step back into the shape they had made for him. A grieving man, a ruined man, a man who had no fight left except with himself. Nate did not step back. He turned toward Boone and asked, "Where is the charge written?" Boone blinked. "What?" "The charge," Nate said. "The paper, the witness, the proof. Show it to me." The question was plain. That made it dangerous. Red Ash had built the whole morning out of noise, and now one quiet question had started pulling boards from under it. Boone looked toward Pike again. Pike gave him a small warning glance, the kind a banker gives when a payment is late. "Sheriff," Pike said, "this is not a courtroom." "No," Nate answered. "It sure is not. In a courtroom, a woman gets shaved before a verdict." A murmur moved through the crowd, different this time. Not anger. Not yet. Unease. The first crack in a hard wall. Clara leaned closer to the bars, holding herself steady with one hand. "The medicine wagon," she said, "was marked with the blue cross from Whitaker's Supply. 3 crates. One had a ribbon tied to the handle. Pink cloth." Nate closed his eyes. He remembered that ribbon. Abigail had tied it there herself when the doctor promised to send fever drops, clean linen, and quinine tablets if the wagon could reach them by dark. She had said the ribbon would help the medicine find its way home. It never did. Nate opened his eyes, and the world looked sharper than before. "Cottonwood Wash," he said. Clara nodded. The driver argued. Pike's men told him the supplies had been bought out. Sent him south. Later, 1 crate went to Pike's ranch. 1 went to the mining camp. The 3rd stayed in town. She looked at Boone then, not Pike. "I saw your deputy unload it behind the bank." Boone's face lost what little color the heat had left him. The deputy had left Red Ash 3 months earlier with a new horse and no farewell. Folks had wondered where the money came from. They had not wondered long. Wondering was work, and Red Ash had never liked work that did not pay cash. Pike laughed once, short and dry. A cage is a poor place to tell stories from, Miss Whitefeather. Nate turned to him. Then let us open it and hear her better. The crowd held its breath. Pike's smile thinned. You always were a sentimental fool, Mercer. That is why you lost everything. The words should have struck hard. Once they would have. But grief, after enough years, can turn into something else. Not healing, not peace. Something heavier. Something that stands. Nate looked toward the livery, where Clara had pointed before, toward the back trough half hidden in shade. Under there waited a leather pouch, maybe proof, maybe another sorrow, maybe the first honest thing Red Ash had seen in years. He faced Boone again. Sheriff, he said, your key is either for that lock or for your conscience. Choose which one you still know how to use. For a while, Sheriff Boone did not move. The key in his pocket might as well have weighed 100 pounds. Red Ash watched him the way a jury watches a trembling witness, waiting to see whether truth would make a man taller or smaller. Boone looked at Clara, then at Nate, then at Jeremiah Pike, and all the years of easy silence gathered on his face like dust on a window. Pike stepped close enough that only the front row could hear him, but his words still carried in the heat. Careful, Sheriff. A town needs order more than it needs old regrets. Boone's jaw tightened. Old regrets. Nate knew that phrase. Men used it when they wanted graves to stay quiet. Pike lifted his hand, and two men near the mercantile straightened from the porch rail. Then two more stepped out from the shade beside the blacksmith shop. Not rushing, not shouting, just appearing where Pike needed them, like shadows that had learned to take orders. The crowd shifted backward, making room for trouble before trouble even asked. Clara saw them and turned her face toward Nate. Do not let him make this a contest of pride, she said. That is what he wants. Nate kept his eyes on Boone. It is not pride to ask a lock why it is closed. One of Pike's men moved toward the livery, slow enough to pretend innocence, quick enough to matter. Clara's hand tightened around the bars. The pouch, she said. Nate turned his head just slightly. The man stopped. Pike smiled again, but the smile was worn thin now, stretched over fear. There is no pouch, he said. Just another tale from a woman who knows she has run out of time. Then let us look, Nate answered. A simple thing. Red Ash did not like simple things when they pointed in the wrong direction. Mrs. Calloway clutched her Bible harder. The apothecary wiped his forehead with a sleeve already damp. Somewhere behind the crowd, a child coughed, and that small sound did what Clara's suffering had not. It made people remember the well, the bitter water, the strange smell, the way Pike had bought 3 ranch notes in a single week after the sickness began. Boone heard it too. His hand rose to his pocket. Pike's voice sharpened. Sheriff. Boone stopped. Nate stepped closer to the cage, not toward Pike, not toward the men, but toward the lock. He took the old board from the front, the one painted with its cruel promise, and pulled it loose from the wire. The sign fell into the dirt face up, ugly words staring at the sky. Nate crouched, took a piece of blackened wood from beside the smithy ash pile, and wrote across the back of the board with slow, heavy strokes. When he stood, he held it where every person in Red Ash could see. She stands under my name. No one breathed right after that. Not Clara, not Boone, not Pike. The words were not romance. They were not ceremony. They were a burden laid down in public, the kind a man could not lift again without everyone knowing he had lied. Pike's eyes narrowed. You would lose what little you have left for her. Nate looked at the cage, at the canteen, at the harmonica in Clara's hand. Then he looked toward the cemetery hill beyond town, where a small grave waited under a cottonwood tree. I already lost what I had, he said. This is what is left. Boone drew the key from his pocket at last. It flashed once in the sun, small as a coin, heavy as judgment. Pike's men did not move. The crowd would remember that later. Not because they were merciful, but because for the first time all morning, they were unsure which side would still be standing when the truth came out. Boone stepped off the porch and walked toward the cage. Each step sounded like a nail being pulled from old wood. Pike whispered his name once more, but the sheriff did not stop this time. And when the key entered the lock, Clara closed her eyes, not in fear, but as if she had been carrying the sound of that click all the way from Cottonwood, Washington. The lock opened with a tired metal cough, and the sound moved through Red Ash like a church bell no one had expected to hear. Boone pulled the door wide, but Clara did not step out at once. She sat there 1 second longer, looking at the open space before her as if freedom had become something strange after hours behind iron. Then she rose carefully, one hand on the bars, the harmonica held against her palm. Nate reached toward her, not touching, only offering steadiness if she chose it. Clara saw the offer. She stepped down on her own. That was the first judgment Red Ash received. Not anger, not a curse, just a woman leaving a cage without asking the town for permission to stand. The crowd parted as she walked toward the livery, slow but certain, with Nate on one side and Boone on the other. Pike followed a few steps behind, his boots no longer sounding clean against the dirt. The men who had stood for him watched their own shadows now. Under the back trough, Clara knelt beside the feed sacks and pushed aside a loose board half buried in straw. Her fingers found the leather pouch where she had hidden it before they took her. For a moment she held it close, as if checking whether truth could still be alive after being left alone in the dark. Then she gave it to Boone. The sheriff opened it with hands that did not shake anymore. Inside lay a small glass vial sealed with wax, a folded invoice from Whitaker Supply, 3 land notes marked in Pike's own hand, and a narrow book of accounts tied with blue string. Boone turned the pages. His face changed with each line. Names, dates, payments, deliveries moved at night, medicine redirected, water rights purchased cheap after sickness began. The town leaned in, hungry now for the truth it had refused when it wore Clara's voice. Boone read one page twice, then looked up at Pike. Jeremiah, he said, and nothing more. Pike gave a soft laugh that had lost its polish. You are making a mistake, Sheriff. Boone closed the account book. I have been making one for years. He turned to the deputy beside him and held out the pouch. Take this to my office. Then he faced Pike again. Jeremiah Pike, you are coming with me. No shout rose from the crowd. No grand speech followed. Justice came smaller than that. It came in the way Pike's shoulders lowered by an inch. It came in the way Mrs. Calloway finally stopped clutching her Bible and looked at Clara like a person instead of a warning. It came in the way the apothecary removed his hat and could not find a word worthy of the damage silence had done. Pike looked to Nate then, searching for hate, perhaps hoping for it, because hate would have made them equals for one breath. Nate gave him none. He only held Abigail's harmonica in his open hand after Clara placed it there. The little instrument was warm from the sun, bent at one corner, scarred and still capable of music. Pike turned away first. Boone guided him toward the jail without force, and the crowd moved aside for the second time that day. The first time, they had made room for fear. This time, they made room for shame. By late afternoon, Red Ash had grown quiet in a way the town did not know what to do with. The cage still sat in the square, empty now, its door open, its cruel sign face down in the dust. No one touched it. Folks walked around it, as if the iron had become a grave marker for the people they had been that morning. Sheriff Boone stayed inside the jail with the account book open on his desk, and through the window Nate could see him sitting under the weight of every page he should have asked for sooner. Jeremiah Pike's name would go to the circuit judge. The land notes would be returned. The poison sacks would be burned outside town. Those were the legal things, the tidy things, the things men wrote down so they could believe justice had edges. But outside, under the lowering sun, the harder work had only begun. Clara stood by the water barrel while a woman filled a tin cup and brought it to her with both hands. Clara accepted it, drank once, and gave the cup back without a word. The woman tried to speak, but shame can dry a throat faster than desert heat. Nate watched from beside his sorrel mare, Abigail's harmonica resting in his palm. It felt smaller than he remembered. Maybe grief had made it large. Maybe memory always did that. Clara came to him slowly, her steps steadier now, the dust of the cage still clinging to her hem. You should keep it, she said. Nate looked down at the little instrument. It was hers. Clara shook her head. It found its way back to you. That is different. He closed his fingers around it, and for a moment he was back on the porch of his cabin, listening to Abigail turn 3 crooked notes into a whole evening of joy. The sound hurt, but it no longer hurt alone. Near sundown, Nate rode with Clara to the small cemetery north of town, where cottonwood leaves trembled in the warm wind. Abigail Mercer's grave rested near the fence, marked by a wooden cross Nate had carved with hands too tired to make the letters straight. He knelt there and placed the harmonica at the base of the cross. Clara stood a few feet away, giving sorrow its proper room. Then she stepped forward and poured clean water from his canteen into the dry earth beside the marker. Not much, just enough to darken the dust. Nate looked at the water, then at her. She said, "A child should never be remembered with thirst." The words settled over him softer than prayer and heavier than stone. For the first time in years, Nate did not ask why the world had taken what it took. He only sat beside the grave until the sun slipped behind the low hills and red ash became a cluster of lamps in the distance. When he finally stood, Clara was looking toward the north road. "Where will you go?" he asked. "Somewhere people still know the difference between law and mercy," she said. Nate looked back at the town, at the jail, at the square where an empty cage waited for morning. Then he untied his mare and walked beside Clara toward the road. He did not know whether he was leaving Red Ash forever or only following the first honest step he had taken in years. Out there, justice did not need a sermon. It did not need a crowd. It only needed one broken man to choose mercy while he still had enough